Hi, everybody. This is Steve Maggi from SMA Law Firm. Welcome to Building the Bridge. I have the honor and privilege of being today with Chris Cavaliere, who is a partner at Shoemaker Law Firm in Tampa and specializes in employment law. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve. I'm looking forward to it.
So some firms are just overrun with work and they want to just have their employees work all the time. As lawyers, we've experienced this with a lot of hours worked. How does this work in terms of different verticals? Does it matter if the person is a foreign employee that's sponsored for a visa? Does it matter if, that they're in a specific state? When it comes to overtime, what are the overtime rules and regulations, and how does this differ for different kinds of employees, or does it?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. So important caveat to start things off, I'm going to focus on federal and Florida law, right? Because some states have their own specific overtime laws.
Okay.
But as far as federal law and Florida law goes, step one is pretty simple, right? And step one is that in general, if this person's an employee, I have to pay all of my employees overtime if they work over 40 hours a week, unless the employee fits within what's called an exemption, right?
Okay.
And that's step two is is my employee exempt? Do they fall within an exemption? That step is much more difficult, right? That analysis is much more difficult. There are several types of exemptions under the Fair Labor Standards Act, and that's the federal law that controls minimum wage and overtime. There are several different exemptions, but the most common three we refer to as the white collar exemptions. And they're called the white collar exemptions because they typically only apply to white collar employees, office workers. They typically do not apply to blue collar or manual workers in the field. Right. So what are those three white collar exemptions? There's the executive exemption,
okay,
the professional exemption, and the administrative exemption. The one thing that all three of those exemptions have in common is that you have to pay a minimum salary to even get to the rest of the analysis. And this is what trips a lot of companies up. A lot of companies are under the misconception that all they need to do is pay a worker a minimum salary. And right now that minimum salary is $35,000 and change. I'd just like to say $36,000 to be safe.
Fair
right?
enough.
A lot of companies think, oh, I don't need to worry about it. I pay this person $36,000. That person's exempt. I don't need to pay them overtime. That forgets that that's just step one of the overtime analysis, right? There is the salary that you have to pay. And then once you determine that you're paying that minimum salary, then you have to actually look at the job duties under each one of these exemptions. And we can get into it in a second, but
wow. Okay, so this gets more and more complex as you unpeel the onion here.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
And it gets more complex because each exemption has its own duties test. Okay. So just from a very high level, I've literally given entire presentations on nothing but the overtime exemption. So this is a tip of the iceberg right now. Under those three white collar exemptions, each one of them has their own duties test. So the executive exemption, again, you don't even get to duties unless you're paying them at least $36,000 roughly.
Well, there's very few executives that are making less than 36,000. So.
Very few. That is true.
Right.
But you don't necessarily have to be an executive in the way that most of us think executive. You don't have to have a C right in front of your name.
Okay.
You don't have to be in the C-suite.
It's defined by duties.
Yeah, generally speaking, if you are in a managerial role and you are managing 2 or more full-time employees, and if you've got hiring and firing authority, or at least your recommendations are given very, very significant weight, in general, you're going to fall within that exemption for the executive exemption. Then there's the professional exemption. This one in general is really reserved for jobs that require a specific education or very special skills. There are creative professionals and learned professionals. I won't bore you with the details on this video, but again, every layer of the onion that you peel back, there's usually another test, right? But just in general, that's a kind of a good takeaway is that does this require special education or special skills, and then talk to a lawyer to get behind it.
Okay.
And then finally, as far as the white collar exemptions go, there's what we refer to as the black hole of the Fair Labor Standards Act, and that's the administrative exemption.
Mm,
This tends to be a catch-all exemption where if the executive or the professional don't really fit, a lot of companies will try to have a worker fit into the administrative exemption. And this gets super complicated, but in general, the administrative exemption typically applies to back of the office employees who have a lot of discretion and independent judgment on
okay.
things that really matter to the
Okay.
company. So human resources is usually a good example, but it's got to be something of significance, and the person cannot really have their job super managed by the company. They have to have a lot of discretion and independent judgment. And
So
as
it's
you
not like a receptionist or just a very basic administrative assistant wouldn't necessarily fall into that exemption.
no, almost certainly not. Almost certainly not.
And what
So
employers hope for is that they can classify, or that they would be classified under one of these exemptions, so then they don't have to pay them overtime.
exactly.
Okay,
Exactly. And these things are, and even for me, I mean, I do this for a living, and it's kind of hard to get in your mind because there's a lot of double negatives that happen here. But
right.
the reason why companies want an exemption is that if a worker qualifies for one of these exemptions, you don't have to pay them overtime. They are exempt from overtime. So generally speaking, for companies, exemption is good, non-exempt is bad, just to, at the risk of
Okay.
oversimplifying.
We're talking about 40 hours per week. Does that include, because we're seeing flexible scheduling, people working from home, et cetera now? Is that Monday through Sunday then?
Whatever the company's defined work week is, and it's a single work week. That's important. A lot of companies will try to retroactively calculate hours.
Right.
No, that you can't do that. If your defined work week is Monday through Friday, you look at the total amount of actual hours worked by the employee during that single work week. And if it's over 40, they get paid time and a half.
So it's not even
all
like a
those.
2 week pay period where the person worked 60 hours one week and 20 the following week and got to 80. They still should do overtime.
Exactly. That's a great point. If you worked over 40 that first work week, that you can still pay them biweekly. You can pay people monthly, right? But
Yeah.
the fact is that you need to be calculating overtime on a single work week basis.
Okay.
And another sort of final takeaway, and this is a big ticket item, and I bring it up because I see this go wrong a lot for a lot of companies, is that when you're calculating overtime, a lot of companies think that all you need to do is take the person's their straight time rate, right? So if their straight time rate is $12.50 an hour, a lot of companies say, well, all I need to do is take that straight time rate and multiply it by 1.5, and that gives you their overtime rate. That's actually not how you calculate overtime. Overtime is calculated at 1.5 times the worker's regular rate. And this is defined in the Fair Labor Standards Act.
Okay.
And you get to the regular rate by essentially, with very few exceptions, you take the total amount of hours that the person has worked, or I'm sorry, you take the total amount of compensation that the person's gotten,
Okay.
including things like non-discretionary bonuses.
Okay.
Okay. And then you divide that by the total number of hours that they work. And that gives you their regular rate. And
Oh,
you
interesting.
half.
Not their prorated based on just on salary rate.
Yeah, a lot of companies will just use the straight time hourly rate and multiply that by time and a half. And it's important to remember, and things get complicated especially when workers are getting multiple different types of bonuses. Maybe some are discretionary and some are non-discretionary. A topic for a different day.
Yeah, I think you just scared employers out of paying bonuses.
Well, discretionary bonuses are good. If it's really a Christmas bonus or a holiday bonus, if it's strictly discretionary, that does not need to be factored into the overtime rate. But if it's quantifiable and measurable and it's promised, more likely to be seen as non-discretionary, and it would need to be factored into that regular rate.
What are the consequences if an employer doesn't pay overtime and the employee eventually figures out, looking at their paycheck, I should have made more money? What happens then?
Yeah, the consequences can be stiff. So if a company fails to pay overtime, and not only are they liable for the amount of overtime that they should have paid in the first place, but then you take that amount and then you have the same amount in liquidated damages. So what do I mean by that? Let's say it's determined that I owe $10,000 to an employee in overtime that I didn't pay them.
Right.
Well, that means I actually owe that employee $20,000 because there was the $10,000 of overtime that I failed to pay them. And then they get the same amount in liquidated damages. Then they also get to recover their attorney's fees, which tend to be the driver in a lot of these cases.
Wow. So the employee can make essentially double their earnings on what corresponds to overtime.
Absolutely, yeah. And the
Wow.
idea behind it is that overtime is such an important thing. And if you are not timely paying it, and if you are taking advantage of your workers or not doing your due diligence, the worker should be compensated not just by being made whole, but there should be a penalty involved. And that's where the
Got
liquidated
it.
damages come in.
To discourage employers from doing it makes sense.
Correct.
Amazing. Such great information. Thank you for sharing that with us, Chris. And if there's an employer out there that wants to know more about how to do things the right way, how do they get in touch with you?
Sure, sure. So you can call me at my direct line at 813-676-7208, or you can email me at cavaliere@shoemaker.com.
Fantastic. Thanks so much today.
Thanks, Steve. Great being here.